The barn fell into a hush so deep it felt like the whole yard had been pressed under a palm. No birds dared sing, no feet shuffled on the dirt, and every pair of eyes focused on the low platform where a horse lay like a fallen monument to something nobody wanted to name. Ribs mapped the slope of his sides like ridges on a map, his skin pulled tight, his coat once a bright chestnut now dulled to the flat brown of old copper, and the only bright thing left on him was a perfect white heart stamped on his forehead, the kind of marking people once called lucky, but nobody was calling that today. Kneeling beside him was a young woman in her 20s, her face streaked with dried grief, fingers trembling as they smoothed the crusted hair along his neck. Her name was Laurelai Quinn. She had been raised on hard soil and weathered fences, the kind of life that taught a person how to hold on and when not to, but nothing in all that taught prepared her for standing at the edge of a decision that would judge a life by the cost of hay. A cardboard sign leaned against the platform, written in a steady hand that did not make room for mercy. $1 not negotiable, the price of giving up. The auctioneer, a man used to turning people into numbers and numbers into actions, felt the air shift and hesitated as he called, $1 going once. Men in denim and quiet faces leaned along the railing, as distant and unreadable as weathered fence posts. Some stared hard, others turned their gaze away not from cruelty, but from a resigned knowledge that had been learned in 1,000 small ways. Sometimes things have to be put down, sometimes owners choose the cheapest way out. The horse had once carried a name like promise, but here he was just a body in the dust, eyes like slow wells of memory. Laurelai did not see an empty shell. She saw the foal who had chased her across a summer pasture with the new and raw curiosity of youth. She saw the white scar tucked behind an ear from a winter storm they had survived together. She saw every small bargain they'd ever made in silence and breath and mud. She saw those things like someone reading a book page by page with a fingertip. Quiet like a confession, she said she would take him. The hush broke as if someone had snapped a brittle twig. The auctioneer blinked, surprised. Laurelai, calm but fierce, fumbled in her jacket and took out a crumpled bill, setting it beside the sign as if laying down a vow. "He is not done," she said in a voice that had been smoothed by too many hard days into something that sounded like resolve. No one mocked her, no one applauded. They only watched as she leaned close and pressed her forehead to the horse's, whispering into the last warmth he seemed to have. In the glossy quiet of his eye, something small shifted, as if a candle buried under ash had been nudged. The single dollar paid for more than a body. It paid for a chance that nobody could have forecast. Rain started minutes after the papers were signed, a steady drizzle that sank into denim sleeves as Laurelai led the horse away. He could not bear his weight without her. His legs gave out in soft, sudden collapses, and she had to lift his ribcage against her own body, whispering to him like those old pastures were still open in the world. Each step felt like a negotiation with fate. The other bidders had already walked away. To them, the show was over. Laurelai had no trailer, no plan, barely enough gas in an old Ford that coughed when the key turned. The hay she had borrowed from a neighbor smelled of damp and age. Yet in his dull eyes she found a stubbornness few people noticed, a small pulse of refusal that suggested he did not agree with the price set for him. At the old barn she borrowed a mattress, smoothed straw into a corner, made a nest, and eased him down with a blanket under his head. He sighed a long, ragged breath, and for a moment it looked like the end. Laurelai listened for heartbeat and found a whisper of one, a rhythm so faint it felt like proof. "He's not dying here," she told him. Not like refuse tossed away. She sat awake through all of the night because once a person has stood at the edge of the world and refused to let it take a thing it shouldn't, sleep stops being an option. Lantern light jittered against rafters as wind hunted around the edges of the barn, the night full of the kind of animals' calls that make the walls feel thin. She told him stories of creek beds and of a mother who had once sung while folding hay before illness took the melody away. Her hand stayed on him, Tears had become too common a practice, so she kept them from falling and simply waited. Just before dawn, small signs began to arrive: a weak kick of a back leg, an ear turning toward the sound of her voice. A slowness came to motion, but movement is a stubborn proof that life is still in someone. As light bled into the slats of the barn, Laurelai watched as the horse's chest moved with slow, steady purpose, and his eyes blinked, reacquainting themselves with the world. For the first time since the platform, hope arrived not as a shout, but as a soft exhale. It changed the air. Morning brought the neighbor Marvin Kane across the field, because some people give without a speech. Laurelai hated asking for help, but she had learned the cost of pride. Marvin arrived with ointment, milk, blankets, and a blunt nod of sympathy. He had been a man of few words for years, but when he saw the horse tracking Laurelai's steps with his eyes, he said two words that left a raw sound in the rafters. Well, damn, the work that followed was a slow, tender repair. Weakness was wrapped, oats were soaked and fed with the slow patience of someone who knows hunger is more than a stomach's ache. A makeshift sling borrowed from a thrift of muscles and rope helped him take a step or two, then another. Weather turned as it often does in country hollows. The sky rung with thunder while lightning cracked the horizon like a judge's gavel. The storm rattled the barn, but it could not batter the new small thing that was growing inside Laurelai's chest, a thing that looked a lot like stubborn hope. Even as the rain drummed over the roof, she read to him from a tattered novel that had once belonged to someone who had taught her how to listen, letting the cadence of words rise and fall until the horse's breathing found steadier rhythm. Through that early week, the horse ate more, stood longer each day, and watched her with eyes that were no longer vacant but focused, curious, remembering. They tried to get him upright with a crude sling and a lever of will, and though the first attempts failed, each attempt taught them something about his balance, about the way his weight shifted, about the places where old injuries still burned. The work was crude and patient, and it began to matter. Then a set of lights cut through a rainy dusk, and a truck rolled to a stop at the fence outside the barn. A figure stepped out, hat low, shoulders broad, reins sluicing from brim and coat. The voice that came into the barn had a shape that made Laurelai's breath catch. Familiar in the way old mistakes are familiar, the man said he had heard that a dead horse had been bought. He moved closer, his eyes sweeping across the stall and landing on the shell of what had once been named. Recognition flashed across his face the way a memory can. It did not take Laurelai long to place his face. Jace Harver. Once he had been part of the machinery of breeding and promise, a man whose ranch had been piled up with pedigree papers and talk of futures. Where there had once been business and bright glass, there had been lawsuits and burning of contracts. Then silence. He had vanished when ledgers closed and creditors circled, leaving behind a dozen animals, among them this horse. Laurelai's anger answered for history, raw and immediate. He didn't think the horse would still be alive, Jace admitted, then tried to untangle excuses. Laurelai's voice was a blade stripped of flourish as she told him he had left him like garbage. The man in front of her flinched in a way that made her remember the time people who made wrong turns once begged for second chances. Jace's eyes softened at the sight of the horse, then hardened again with memory. He said something Laurelai had not expected. Hollow had never been meant to be an oval track champion. He had been bred for other things, attributes that did not shine under the bright lights of pedigrees and prize rings. He had been bred as an answer to a dare, to a belief that not every valuable thing could be measured by registries and bloodlines. The confession cracked open a new seam of feeling. It meant Hollow had not been simply discarded for failure. He had been something else, a secret, a protest, a living argument that some rules were wrong. The words rearranged how Laurelai understood the wreckage of the past. Hollow was more than her horse. He was evidence of a gamble, her father's unfinished fight, a small rebellion that had been buried when fear and authority came to town. The barn felt smaller and bigger at the same time, filled now with the weight of a few men's choices and the raw need of a life to be seen. Night fell without sleep for Laurelai again, but this time the night was full of plans and ache. The horse, slowly on his feet with the help of splints and bales for support, ate and rested and shifted his weight with a patience that felt like a plea. A week later, an official letter arrived stamped by the registry that kept pedigrees like they were scripture. It declared an unauthorized possession claim over an unregistered stallion, a pending review and threat of seizure. Words on paper that could be read a dozen ways, but all of them ending in the same squares of loss. Those who guard lineage like currency had a language for removing a problem: humane euthanasia. The letter was a blade laid on the table in neat typed lines. It did not take long for Laurelai to make the only choice she could understand. She would not hide the horse. She would show the world that the animal lived and that living had value beyond certificates. She would enter Hollow in the Fall Valley exhibition, a showcase where horsemanship and bonds could be displayed for all to see. It was madness to plan such a thing. It was also the only thing that felt right. Marvin turned up with a battered trailer and a pair of worn saddles, not to talk her out of it, but to make sure she could go down swinging if she chose to go down at all. Jace did not offer help in the way a grown man might when he wants to make amends. He simply watched, and by the time the morning of the exhibition broke, he stood by a gate like a man who had been given space to witness without being asked to perform. The grounds of Fall Valley were a museum of tradition. Polished trailers lined the space like marble columns. Men and women in neatly pressed jackets carried pedigrees like family crests. Hollow, rough in coat and gait but steady in spirit, stood among fine animals whose movements had been trained into art. Laurelai wore her father's old jacket, boots that had been scuffed by 100 small missteps, and she walked into the ring with a steady hand on the horse's neck. The aim was not to steal ribbons from the pedigreed, but to let a truth stand where everyone could see it. This animal existed and belonged. The crowd did not rise to cheer. They whispered and watched and tried to fit what they saw into their old boxes of rules. A judge said quietly that the horse was unregistered. A man in the bleachers called the exhibition a fraud, and the noise of skeptical attention swelled for a minute. Laurelai faced the judges and the crowd with a voice that did not shake, though it carried the weight of many things unsaid. She told them plainly that the horse had been bred by a man who had believed in worth beyond papers, that he had been abandoned and starved, and then bought back with $1 because someone finally refused to let him be treated like trash. The arena held its breath. Not everyone would be persuaded, not every opinion would change, but then something small and powerful happened. The oldest judge rose, removed his glasses, and asked quietly for the horse's name. When Laurelai replied, almost a whisper, the judge said he had been watching exhibitions for decades and had never seen a bond like that. A murmur moved through the crowd like a breeze through dry grass, and then a slow applause began at the back and grew, not loud but honest. Hollow stood, ears alert, his chest calm. The sound touched something in him that had been hungry for recognition for longer than he could recall. Jace watched the same scene, arms folded, hat in hand, face not smiling but softening in a way that felt like forgiveness without a false promise. After the exhibition, Laurelai sat with Hollow in the empty barn offered by the showgrounds. A ribbon for honor of presentation hung from a rail, not gold for first, but braided for recognition of courage. Someone had seen them and understood that survival could be a kind of victory. A small envelope was handed to her by Marvin, her name scrawled in a hand she knew from memory. Inside was a note in a script grown faint with time, a letter from a father never given the chance to see the end of what he started. The words were short and careful. If you ever bring him home, it means you are stronger than I was. Do not let them tell you who deserves to be remembered. Those words landed, took root. They did not ease the past, but they gave shape to a future. Hollow lay beside her, breathing easy for the first long stretch in months, not only surviving but belonging. News travels in small towns in the way a creek carries leaves. and once an animal steps into the light, it rarely goes unnoticed. The registry's letter had warned of seizure, the letter's shadow still hung. But there had been something else gained on the ring that day, a ripple in the audience that meant standing in the light had shifted at least a few opinions. The fight that had been left unfinished by men who made risky choices and then walked away had shifted into new hands. Laurelai found herself at a threshold where sorrow and stubbornness met. The horse with the white heart on his brow had been a repository for secrets, guilt, and the stubborn hope of a family that had tried to change a system. He had carried a brand, a faint crescent and star under the mane, something her father had burned there as a quiet emblem that would outlast pedigrees and ledgers. That mark told her more than any certificate ever could. Some ties are forged by belief rather than approval. People in the community began to help in small and practical ways. The neighbor with a rusted tractor fixed a fence, a vet offered a discounted visit, someone slipped a bale of hay into the barn at night. These were not grand gestures, but they were the kind of steady things that mattered over the long arc of healing. Days grew into weeks, Hollow's legs grew stronger, and the rhythms of care settled into an ordinary kind of grace. People who had never spoken to Laurelai in more than passing nodded as they passed the barn, because the story of the wrecked stallion had become less about scandal and more about a stubborn life refusing to die. Jace came around sometimes, not as a man seeking absolution, but as a witness. He carried his regrets quietly, which was perhaps the only thing he could offer without betraying his own need to move forward. On cool mornings, they would find him standing at the fence, as if watching an old, unresolved film. He did not speak much, but his presence felt like someone returning tools that had been left in the dirt. The registry's threat did not vanish. It lingered like a shadow at the edge of every good thing, a bureaucratic reminder that the world values paperwork. But the exhibition had done more than display a horse. It had made the idea that worth could be measured in more than forms and fees visible. Neighbors who had once traded barbs in diner booths began to trade supplies and quiet offers of help. A local farrier worked for the cost of a good meal. A child who had never been to a proper show came with a hand-me-down ribbon he claimed as his own to present to Hollow. Little things added up. The horse continued to teach lessons. The farm, once a place of loss and bitterness, became a slow garden of repair. The work of care grounded Laurelai. She learned to time feedings, to mend a pulpy wound with salves, to ride in a way that taught Hollow to carry weight again without panic. Each small success was not about victory over a system, but about a present shaped by love and stubbornness. The affair that had started with $1 had become a ripple of change. People who had once folded their arms and declared facts now asked questions that did not flatter them. Once a year, a small crowd would gather in a pasture for a low-key schooling show, where horses who were not meant for manic speed could show their work. Hollow became a regular there, not to win first place, but to remind people that a horse is more than a line in a ledger. Sometimes during late afternoons when the light laned golden over the barn roof, Laurelai would sit on the steps and listen to the horse chew hay and feel the tug of memory like a soft ache. She carried the letter from her father folded in her pocket next to a photograph of him laughing beside a younger, livelier Hollow. She had no interest in rewriting every wrong in the world, but she had a fierce commitment to keep this life safe, to let the horse prove his worth on his own terms. The story spread beyond the county, too, in fitful waves. Someone from a neighboring town had taken a piece of the tale and told it in better language and with fewer of the small, precise details that keep things true. It came back stripped and bright, and while that brought attention that made the barn busier, it also brought more telling eyes. Still, the thing that mattered most was plain: a life had been reclaimed. After a slow season of recovery, Laurelai and Hollow returned to the ring not to prove pedigree, but to show bond. They moved together in imperfect harmony, and the small crowd who came to watch found themselves moved by the stubborn poetry of two beings who had refused to be told they did not matter. That stubbornness had been paid for with a single dollar, but it cost far more than any note could show. Nights without sleep, rusted trailers, arguments with people who could not understand why anyone would risk so much. In the quiet that followed those exhibitions, people would sometimes stop by the barn with a pocketful of grain or a hot cup of coffee for Laurelai, and the world felt softer in the place where her hands met the horse's neck. It did not change the fact that the registry could still decide to act, but it did change the terms of the fight. Instead of being a private argument carried by a few men, the horse's case had become a living example everyone could see and touch. That awareness made enforcement harder and public opinion matter in ways cold paper could not counter. A year moved on and seasons rolled. Hollow's coat grew healthy and his gait regained dignity. So did Laurelai's life, not in the ways of grand wealth, but in the slow accumulation of belonging. The barn took on a new meaning, shelter not just for animals, but for a story rewritten into something generous. Men who had once been quick to dismiss what they could not control learned to make room for things that did not fit into their neat boxes. The horse never became the champion a registry might have liked, but he became something steadier and truer, a symbol of stubborn worth, of a family's unfinished promise, and of a woman who refused to let a life be priced at $1. The white heart on his forehead wore the sun and rain, and the touch of hands that would never let him go hungry again. Stories like this change people in small, enduring ways. They do not rewrite every rule, but they open a crack through which something honest can escape. If this tale meant something, consider staying part of the next quiet rebellion. Tap like to mark that dignity matters. Subscribe to keep watching lives reclaimed and shared. And share this story so it can find other hands that will refuse to let the world price living at the cost of a single dollar.